Good afternoon, everybody. Not quite afternoon yet. But it's my pleasure to introduce my friend Larry Hamm this morning. For many of you, he really doesn't need an introduction because Larry has been out in the forefront of social justice for well over 40 years now. He started literally as a kid. And so rather than read his bio, which probably many of you have already read, let me just say that Larry is a long-distance runner. He really does run. And that's kept him in good shape for the many years of social justice advocacy that he has done throughout the state of New Jersey and sometimes around the country. So, rather than give a long introduction, let us give a UU welcome to Larry Hamm, a long-distance runner.
Good morning. On behalf of the organization that I represent, the People's Organization for Progress, I bring you greetings from folks in POP all over New Jersey. And before I say anything else, I want to say as soon as I came through the door and I looked into this sanctuary, I saw this banner here, standing on the side of love. Now, I don't know if it was this particular banner, but I know that Universalist Unitarians carried a banner just like this one when we had our Million People's March against police brutality in Newark, New Jersey on July 25th. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for your participation and your support of the Million People's March. And I must say, in all honesty, the POP has been in existence for 33 years, and I would say for at least 20, maybe 25 of those 33 years, we have always worked in coalition with different groups, and those groups included various Unitarian congregations around the state of New Jersey. Some of you know that I'm no stranger in your congregations. I've spoken to Universalist Unitarian congregations all over the state of New Jersey. But this is the first time I've been to this church here in Cherry Hill, and I'm glad to be here with you this morning. I was asked today to talk about the current struggle for racial and economic justice. And I must say, first of all, that the Unitarians and those among you who have been working on this issue of mass incarceration, you have been moving in the right direction, and give those folks who've been working on that issue a big hand, because mass incarceration is a cornerstone of the agenda for racial justice. And I'm glad to see that you've been fighting on issues such as youth being put in solitary confinement and other related issues. And when I was in your vestibule there, I saw a display for Black Lives Matter. And Becky told me that you had put up a sign that said Black Lives Matter, and several times somebody tore that sign down. But no matter how many signs they tear down, we are not going to stop the struggle for racial justice, are we? As we reflect on the struggle for racial and economic justice, the month of April holds a very special date in that regard. And that date, among others, is April the 4th. It was April 4th, 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, standing there at about 6 o'clock p.m. when an assassin's bullet tore through his jaw and pierced its way through his neck, breaking vertebrae along the way. He did not die immediately. He was taken to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead on about 7:01 p.m. on April the 4th. It is almost impossible to have an informed discussion about the struggle for racial justice and not talk about the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King, whose words seem to ring true to us today. He's been dead, believe it or not, for 48 years. But here's the strange thing. 48 years after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, there are still thousands of pages of classified documents pertaining to his assassination that are scheduled not to be released to the people of the United States until 2027. That would make it almost 60 years after his assassination. What is it that needs to be kept a secret for almost 10 more years about the assassination of Dr. King? Are there people still waiting to die before they want to release these papers? The People's Organization for Progress says, release all documents now pertaining to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I hope that you would join us in making that demand. It is not a closed case. It is not a closed case. They would like it to be a closed case. Just like they would like us to stop talking about the assassination of John Kennedy. Just like they would like us to stop talking about the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Do you realize that in about a 5-year period, not a 50-year period, not a 15-year period, in a 5-year period, a number of leaders, national leaders, who were speaking out on the issues of peace and racial and economic and social justice were assassinated. Probably more than I can mention here. We know in 1963, John Kennedy was assassinated. We know Dr. Ziad, February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. We know April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated. We know in June, just 3 months after the assassination of Dr. King, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And I believe that all of these men were assassinated because they were trying to steer the ship of state in a direction toward peace and justice. And those conspirators who were involved in their assassinations had hoped that by assassinating them, They would not only kill those men, but kill a movement. But I'm here to tell you today, they can kill dreamers, but they can't kill the dream for peace and equality and social justice. While we're talking about declassifying information, this is not part of the subject, but I feel I must mention it anyway. Dr. King's assassination, as far as we're concerned, is not a closed case, but I tell you another issue that's not a closed case as far as we're concerned, and that is 9/11. There are still 28 pages. Now we're talking about the official. I'm not talking about the volumes that have been written on the 9/11 disaster, catastrophe, tragedy, that have been written by others. The official 9/11 Commission report of the United States government has 28 pages that are still classified and being kept from the general public. I call for the declassification and release of those 28 pages. We need to know the whole story. We need to know the whole story. The month of April also holds the date, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. When we talk about the struggle for racial justice and economic justice, it inevitably brings us to the point of realization when we begin to understand that what we must confront ultimately is state power. And that there are people who run and control this country who are willing to stop at nothing to preserve the status quo. Yes, we live in a democracy. We have elections. But it always seems that when we begin to get ourselves together just enough to begin to impact and affect the electoral process to the point where we might make some real serious change, then the rules of the game change. They'll talk about democracy as long as democracy is working in their favor. But when democracy is no longer working in their favor, if they have to, they will bring out the gun. They will assassinate leaders at home. And as we know, our country has intervened in the affairs of other nations more than 200 times since the founding of the Republic. We cannot achieve racial justice and economic justice and social justice unless we are ready to confront state power. This is a hard thing for a lot of people to accept. It's very difficult because, like you, we were raised on a narrative that told us that our government was okay, that it serves the people, it works in our interests, that we just have to let the Constitution, leave the Constitution alone, let it do its job, and everything will be okay. I remember, Reverend Hirschberg, when I was in the 6th grade at South 17th Street School, we had an auditorium program. And I don't know if y'all remember, any of y'all old enough to remember the song, The Green Berets? Fighting soldiers from the sky, fearless men who jump and die. 100 men they'll test today, but only 3 will wear the green beret. They taught us that in school. But do you know why they taught us that? They were preparing us, 6th graders and 5th graders, to be soldiers in the war against Vietnam. Isn't that where the Green Berets were? And isn't it ironic that a year to the day that Dr. King gave his famous speech, we call it Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam, but the real name of the speech is A Time to Break Silence, because Dr. King had been silent on the war for a long time. He had been being torn between the poles of principle and expediency. Expediency demanded that he remain silent on the war in Vietnam so that President Johnson would support civil rights legislation and help to ferry it through Congress. Just don't talk about the war, Dr. King. John Lewis, who was the president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at the time, was the only youth to speak at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but they wouldn't let him speak until they edited his speech. Because as early as 1963, black folk were understanding, some black folk were understanding the relationship between the struggle against war abroad and poverty at home. And John Lewis was going to talk about the Vietnam War in his speech. And the folks running the rally said, no, John Lewis, you can't read this speech. You have to read it without this part. And you can actually go online and find the part of John Lewis's speech that was taken out. Dr. King was wrestling with his conscience. He could no longer be silent. And he said the Vietnam War was like a giant demonic suction tube, sucking up the resources of the war on poverty and sending those resources abroad as bombs to explode and kill Vietnamese men, women, and children abroad. He couldn't be silent any longer. And he gave this great speech on April the 4th, 1967. He was assassinated a year to the day, April the 4th, 1968. And I believe that we have been in a fundamental holding pattern ever since, because we were making great progress in the struggle for racial justice. We were making great progress. We destroyed the system of de jure segregation that we call Jim Crow. Dr. Ziad is old enough to remember, I'm old enough to remember Jim Crow. And Jim Crow wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. Becky, it was a Northern phenomenon. Because in the movie theaters of Newark, New Jersey, the Paramount, the Lowe's, the RKO Proctors, the Branford, the Adams, black people could not sit in the mezzanine The main section, we had to sit in the balcony in Newark, New Jersey. I got on a train in 1962. This train still runs today. You go to Penn Station, Newark, you look at the big board, and you'll see Silver Meteor. It's an Amtrak train now that runs the East Coast. And I was one of those little bad kids they had to send down south every summer. Because if they let me stay up here, I'd have gone to jail. Sent me down to my cousin Johnny and Martha's farm in Gainesville, Georgia. We got on the train, my Aunt Gladys, my mother, and my grandmother's sister Joan at Penn Station in Newark. And when we got to Union Station in Washington, D.C., the conductor came and told us we had to move to the rear of the train, to a car in the back. Why was that? Why did that happen in the citadel of democracy? Because Washington, D.C. sits on the Mason-Dixon line. And once you cross that line, in 1962, the laws pertaining to segregated interstate travel came into effect. So Jim Crow was a national phenomenon, just like slavery. Slavery was a national phenomenon. New Jersey had slaves. In 1860, there were over 12,500 registered slaves in the state of New Jersey. When Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, New Jersey state legislature nullifies Lincoln's power to emancipate slaves in this state. New Jersey was the last northern state to abolish slavery and did not do so on its own. It did so by virtue of the passage of the 13th Amendment. And there were 36 states, you needed a 3/4 majority, a 27-state majority. New Jersey was not in the 27-state majority to ratify the 13th Amendment because this state of Woodrow Wilson was very much in sympathy with the South. Lincoln didn't win New Jersey in 1860, he didn't win it in 1864. And a lot of slaves, when they got to Jersey, they kept going. They did not stop here. There's a church, the old First Presbyterian Church in Newark, got a tunnel still there, tunnel under the church. Tunnel goes all the way out to the port because they wanted to get out of Jersey. But we were making progress, but by 1968, Dr. King had said the country had already turned its back on the war against poverty. It already turned its back on the struggle for racial desegregation. Don't you know New Jersey is like the 5th most racially segregated state in the nation? We are more segregated in this state than in other states down in Dixie. Our school system is like the 4th or 5th most segregated in the nation. And we talk a good liberal game, but our practice does not bear that out. So we stand here today and we sit here today on this 16th day of the year 2016 in the 21st century, finding in fact that we have actually gone backward. We have retreated. We haven't just stood in place. We have actually retreated in the struggle for racial equality in this country and in this state. We have retreated. I read a speech by Lyndon Johnson, the speech he gave when he signed the Voting Rights Act in '65. I didn't know if I was reading Lyndon Johnson or Stokely Carmichael. But that was the ethos. That was the zeitgeist of the time. People talk about the terrible 60s. The 60s was one of the best periods of the 20th century because people were struggling for change, struggling for justice. And no one could escape it. So even the people who were in power had to acknowledge that struggle. But since 68, since the assassination of Dr. King, since the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, since the election of Richard Nixon, we have retreated. Frederick Douglass said in 1857, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. But one other revolutionary said, where there is oppression, there is resistance. It is in the nature of human beings to struggle against injustice. And the struggle did not stop. The nation and its institutions have retreated, but people have continued to struggle. And we've seen these struggles over this past decade. The Occupy movement was a great movement. It's not in effect now, but it forced into the national discourse discussion about economic inequality, which people were ignoring. If it hadn't been for Occupy, we would have had the most mundane and bland political discourse that we had for the last 48 years. They broke through that. And then the Occupy movement was followed by this Black Lives Matter movement. And I don't know what you think. I know some of you don't like these young people going into the candidates' events and interrupt them, but I say power to those young people. They're doing the right thing. Even I got a little bit out of shape because I was for Bernie Sanders. And I know Bernie is saying the stuff I wanted to be said to Black Lives people up in there. And I was like, why are the Black Lives people in Berkeley? Because it's all white. This is the contradiction. I'm going to be a Bernie delegate, but I'm not going to talk to you as a campaigner this morning. I'm going to talk to you as a truth teller. I'm for Bernie. But it must be eminently clear to anyone that wants to have a successful political and social revolution in this country, you can't build a movement without the masses of black people involved also. That movement will not succeed. Fuck Bernie. He's starting where he is. And he's trying to be inclusive. But I think the Black Lives, in retrospect, having now interacted with some of the campaign staff and seeing what I've seen, that the Black Lives Movement people, they did the right thing. It's a wake-up call. Because we can't just talk about economic justice. The struggle for economic justice is bound up part and parcel with the struggle for racial justice. It's one struggle. It's one struggle. We saw Occupy. We saw Black Lives Matter. And I fully support the Black Lives Matter movement, but I wish they hadn't taken, when they changed the slogan, it looked to me like they took the emphasis. People were saying, stop police brutality. Now, I know Black Lives Matter addresses the existential question, Dr. Ziad. You know, I'm all for addressing the deep question. But before people were saying Black Lives Matter, they were saying stop police brutality. And the police were catching it. I mean, they had never seen as much public outrage as they had seen over the issue of police brutality. And then when the slogan came up, Black Lives Matter, the immediate response from racist elements and people who are politically unconscious, well, white lives matter too. And we got into a discussion about lives. But the struggle against police brutality still goes on, and we have to keep the focus on it. And I know a lot of you want to talk
got Abdul Kamal in Irvington, New Jersey, who had a cell phone in his hand when he was shot 15 times by black police in Irvington, New Jersey. We have Jerome Reed, who got out the car with his hands up, no weapons in his hand when he was shot at point blank range and killed by Officer Brahim Days in Bridgeton, New Jersey. We got Kashad Ashford, who, yes, was in a stolen car, but the car was disabled, stopped, and he was unconscious when he was shot in the head 4 times by Lyndhurst and State Trooper police. And we have in Trenton, New Jersey, Radaz Hearns, 14 years old, shot 4 times in the back. They said he had a weapon, but he had no weapon at the time he was shot. And he survived. The People's Organization for Progress, we call upon and we ask you, Universalist Unitarians, to join us, to call upon the U.S. Attorney for the state of New Jersey, Paul Fishman, asking him to launch civil rights investigations immediately into the deaths of Kashad Ashford and Jerome Reed and Abdul Kamal and the shooting of Radaz Hearns. We've started something we call Justice Mondays. Every Monday, we got it from the Moral Mondays. Every Monday, we go to the Federal Building in Newark at 970 Broad Street. We go there, we protest every Monday, demanding federal investigations into these cases. And I have to say that Paul Fishman has responded as a result of the pressure that's been put on his office. They have launched a civil rights investigation into the shooting of Jerome Reed, and they're joined by the FBI in that. But we say, Mr. Fishman, don't stop there. It's not a Bridgeton problem. It's not just a Newark problem. It's a national problem. We want investigations into all of those efforts. In fact, the city of Newark today is undergoing, its police department is going to undergo a major transformation as a result of the protests that have been going on for years. People's Organization for Progress, together with the ACLU of New Jersey, held a number of hearings where all these cases were brought out about police brutality, and the ACLU wrote to the Justice Department. And as a result of that, the Justice Department came in and did a 3-year investigation of the police department in Newark. 3 of those years, the years that Cory Booker was the mayor. And that same one that's in Chicago, who's the police chief there, or who had to leave. He had to leave Newark, then he had to leave Chicago, McCarthy. And what did the Justice Department find? Justice Department found, yes, the Newark Police Department was engaged in the use of excessive force. Yes, the police department was engaged in violating people's constitutional rights. And yes, the police department was engaged in racially discriminatory practices because 85% of those who were stopped and frisked were African American. And not only that, they found that the police department, its gang and drug units, were engaged in criminal activity. The drugs and guns that they were taking off the young men they were arrested were not being turned in. They were selling them themselves. This is not a secret. You can go to NJ.com and just Google Justice Department investigation of Newark Police Department. It's all there. And as a result of that 3-year investigation, the Newark Police Department is going to be put under a federal consent decree, a schedule of reforms that the Newark Police Department must implement in order to eradicate these problems from the department. And in addition to that, one of the things the Justice Department calls for was the creation of civilian oversight of the Newark Police Department. And for the first time in the 350-year history of the city of Newark, under the Ras Baraka administration, the city of Newark will have its first police review board in its history. And that's a result of a half-century of struggle that began with Amiri Baraka in 1966. But I want to be a truth teller. City of New York has had a police review board since 1965, with subpoena power, by the way. And they have just as much police brutality there as anywhere else. Police review boards, legislation is not enough. The greatest antidote to police brutality is the masses of people organized and mobilized to fight against police brutality and put constant pressure on the police and other institutions of state. That is the great lesson of U.S. history. That no change that benefits regular folk, common folk, working folk, poor folk, middle class folk, whatever label you want to put on folk, no change comes to us from on high. Every social reform, whether it's for racial justice or workers' rights or women's rights or gay rights, disabled people's rights, none of these things came about from the beneficence of those in power. All of these things came about through people's struggle. And this is the critical juncture we stand at now. I believe that after some 48 years of relative dormancy, with some exceptions here and there, I believe that we are going into a great period of social upheaval. And I know some of you don't like that kind of talk, but I don't care. I'm not running for office. I was in Newark. I was 12 years old in 1967 when on July 13th they beat and nearly killed a cab driver named John Smith. And I remember when the rebellion erupted in my neighborhood. I lived literally blocks from Fairmount Avenue where they beat Thomas Smith. Riot. But it was no riot. It was an insurgency. It was a rebellion. That's what it was. It was a riot. Even the Governor Hughes, called it a rebellion. He knew. Because when does a riot become a rebellion? When does a civil disturbance become an insurgency? Well, maybe it was because the entire Newark police force couldn't put it down. And well, maybe they called in 700 state troopers and the combined police and state troopers couldn't put it down. And well, maybe it was when they brought in 1,500 National Guard. And that wasn't enough because Governor Hughes had to declare a state of emergency. That is a military move. And I believe that in this country, we are headed for a period of great unrest. Why? Because people want unrest? No. Because the people are suffering. That's why. People are suffering. We have twice as many people living in poverty today than when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. The people are suffering. The middle class have lost more homes to foreclosure than in the previous 50 years of history. The people are suffering. Factories are being closed all over the country and being shipped abroad so that the factory owners can pay slave wages to the people of the third world. The people are suffering. Our children are being poisoned with lead in Flint and in Newark and in Camden. The people are suffering. They are suffering. And they can't take it anymore. And when people can't take it anymore, they rise up. And then the question becomes, which side are you on? Will you be on the side of the suffering? Or will you be on the side of those causing the suffering? And I close with this, brothers and sisters. Now, more than ever before, we need a movement in this country. There are going to be movements. Yes, there'll be a black movement, and there'll be a Latino movement, and there'll be a women's movement, and there'll be a gay people's movement, and there'll be a disabled people's movement, and there'll be consumer movements. But what we got to do is get all those movements together to work in a people's movement to transform this country. We can do it. The greatest obstacle is only how much we circumscribe our own imaginations. Amen. Because one book said, I read somewhere, where there is no vision, the people perish. Yes, just a few months ago, a $15 an hour minimum wage seemed like a dream, but people rose up and it's being implemented throughout the country now. I am telling you, when we get together, when we organize, when we unite, and when we fight back, the walls of evil will fall like the walls of Jericho. Thank you very much, brother.
Tears. And I want to thank him so much for his inspiration and that sustained commitment, because this is a man who has done it for how many years now?
Since I was 17, so 46 years.
Which is why we cannot stop what we're doing, and we need to sustain what Unitarian Universalists can help to be an ally in this work.
You've been a good ally.
I think Larry offered to have a few questions. Does anyone have any questions? Or do you want to just all settle a little bit?
Stand up.
I wanted to ask a question. What do you feel is the importance of having the black community and the white community work together for shared causes? How important do you feel it is that the communities work together? And you, let me phrase this.
think it is imperative that black people, white people, red people, yellow people, all the people continue to communicate and find ways to work together. Now, I come out of a tradition where black self-determination was absolutely paramount. Black people, in many respects, I hate to use this term, but for lack of another term, within the United States, we live in a kind of internal colonialism. In 1960, the city of Newark was already majority black by 1960. But it took until 1970 to elect a black mayor. Prior to that, in Newark and throughout the country, we lived under apartheid. The South Africans, I shouldn't even say a kind of apartheid. Jim Crow was some innocuous term that we used to describe what was going on. But the South Africans actually learned it from us. There was no apartheid in 19th century South Africa. It was a relatively modern creation. And they learned it by lifting the laws from our law books. Even the system of Bantustans in South Africa was modeled on the Native American reservations that existed here in the United States. How ironic. So black people, until the Black Power era, had no real voice. All the institutions in the black community were like white control. Like, I grew up in Newark. I lived in a predominantly black, almost all black neighborhood. There was one black teacher in our entire school, Mrs. Green. And I never had her. I never had her. There was one black teacher in the entire school. So black people had no control over the institutions that affected our lives. We didn't control the schools, we didn't control the economic institutions, we didn't control the political institutions, we didn't set the social policy. So the struggle for black power was all about empowering people who were living under racial apartheid. So that, to a degree, was achieved. And black self-determination is still very much a part of black people's struggle. Like, we can speak for ourselves, you know? Now, during the civil rights movement, early on, blacks and whites were working together. But as the Black Power movement gained traction, some of that unity melted away. And in fact, some of the black nationalist advocates said that white youth should go in white communities and try and turn the racial attitudes around in white communities. And so for a long time, there was not the kind of discussion going on that there actually had been going on during the civil rights movement. I think today that black self-determination is still important, because very much so, we still, even though we have some black politicians, we still don't really control what's in our communities, especially the economic institutions. But I say this: we have to talk to one another, and we have to work with one another. In 1974, my term was up on the Board of Education. I had been the youngest school board member in the history of the United States. I wasn't a student representative. I was appointed at age 17 to be one of the 9 voting members of the Newark Board of Education. When my term was up on the board, I went back to school. But I had a lot of questions, because during the era of black power, we had elected black politicians, and we saw that the fundamental condition of black people still wasn't changed. You know, there had been this very kind of innocent, simplistic belief that if we just put black faces in high places, they would take care of it. Everything would be all right. We hadn't really grasped the question of class. And then after I left Newark and began to do some study, reflection, etc., began to understand the economic underpinnings of the system of institutional racism in this country. So I give you that long to say that in the black community, we have to grasp this issue of class and how the economic system affects us. But in the white community, folks have to grasp, who to a degree understand the class question, have to grasp the system of the issue of race. And we both have to work together. It's my belief, it's my sincere belief that none of our groups by ourselves are going to be able to transform the system. We're in the belly of the beast. We're in the epicenter of worldwide imperialism. We're not just oppressing at home, we're oppressing at home and abroad. We don't just control people's destiny here, we control people's destiny. They have flags, they have parliaments abroad, but we're calling the shots. And when we don't like what their parliaments are doing, we go in and we overthrow their government. If we can do it peacefully, we do it peacefully. If it can't be peacefully, we go in with the gun. I know this is a long way around answering your question, but the long and the short of it is that we have to communicate and we have to find ways to work together. If that's in coalitions, fine in coalitions. If we can work together as individuals, I think that's fine too, where that is applicable. But we have to find a way to build a broad-based movement for social transformation behind a people's agenda, you know. And I think to some degree, the Sanders campaign is addressing that to some degree. But it's going to be a real question as what the outcome of this is going to be. You know, with like Bernie, you know, I was in the Jackson campaign of '88. I think that's where I met Dr. Ziad back in '88. You know, and we just knew Jesse could win, and we got to the convention, and what they do, they pulled out the superdelegates. It's like a trap door. The superdelegates are 1/3, almost 1/3 of all the delegates. 600 superdelegates. And I think they're going to do the same thing to Sanders. Even though I'm trying to be a Sanders delegate, I'll be on the ballot. But I think they're going to do the same thing to him. If by some miracle he ends up with as many elected delegates as Hillary, when they get there, the party leadership is going to instruct the superdelegates to vote for Hillary. Now, and I want to be clear on this, if Hillary is the nominee, then I think we should all support Hillary. I think we should do that. If she becomes a nominee, because see, what people want us to do, they want us to split. The forces that oppose us want us to split. They want us to get to the convention, and they want the people who were really behind Sanders to say, well, if it ain't going to be Sanders, I ain't going to vote. I think that's wrong. That's my opinion. You may think it's right. I'm just giving you my opinion. I think that's wrong. The worst thing that we could do is let these reactionaries, be it Trump or Cruz or whoever they put up, get the White House and then appoint 3 reactionary judges to the next Supreme Court. That would be the worst possible scenario. I know a lot of folks are moved by conscience, and I understand that. I understand that you understand that this system is so corrupt. It's corrupt from the top to the bottom. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. But when you're in a war, you have to make tactical and strategic decisions that help advance you to the next battle. No war is one battle, right? There are many battles along the road to victory. And I know that's a long answer, I'm sorry, but I've thought a lot about this question of black people and white people working. We have to work together. That's the bottom line. We have to work together.
My heart was racing after your speech. I wasn't able to quite communicate. But my point, I guess, is, and my question is that a lot of the issues involving public works projects, like in Newark,
Right.
And the lead contamination referred with the schools and the general municipality.
Right.
My concern is that by making this issue a black issue, that you're ignoring the fact that a lot of these issues we're dealing with are shared issues.
Right.
That affect both the black and the white community.
Right.
And I
Because I'm going to tell you this. Now, I know everybody in here don't feel like I feel, but just bear with me for a minute. If by some miracle we were able tomorrow to create, let's just say, a social democracy like that of Sweden, or Norway, or Denmark, which have the highest standards of living in the world, by the way. Just bear with me. If we did that tomorrow, there would still be racial inequality. Socialism is a system of wealth redistribution. It is not a panacea. It is not magic. Things don't disappear as soon as you create worker cooperatives or state-owned enterprises. Social problems persist. And it's my belief that we can have as much racial inequality under a social democratic or socialist country as we would under a capitalist country. Amen. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but I think the record, for those of you who've engaged in travel and who have been to some of these countries, including my love, Cuba, know that black people still, that the darker skinned people are still on the bottom. So I think it's both class and race. Yes, we need a national jobs program to put all the unemployed back to work. Point blank, I agree with it 100%. But what do we know about the New Deal? We know that the New Deal that we point to as an example, that many of the New Deal initiatives racially discriminated. That black workers were not able to avail themselves of the New Deal programs the same way white workers were. Now, I know you don't like to hear that, but I got to tell you the truth. I know you might not invite me back, but that's okay. This is true. Read Bill Sales' book on this. Professor William Sales from Seton Hall University. He did a book on this. How the New Deal programs engage in racial discrimination. As a matter of fact, Social Security, when it was first created, did not cover the job categories that many black people were engaged in, including agriculture. And maybe still don't. I'm not an expert on this, but maybe you're right. So what I'm saying is we have to have both. We have to address both class and race. We have to put forward an agenda that benefits everybody. But what does benefiting everybody mean? Does that mean that I'll be able to go from rung 1 to rung 2 and there's still 5, 6, and 7 ahead of me, above me? Or does it mean that we'll all basically we won't even have a ladder no more. We'll stand together on the stage of a new day in history. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
We are terribly behind. If I have your permission, we'll take another. Are you okay with this? Or
Yes.
Okay, all right, yeah. This is, I know, we could listen to you all day. Al.
Thank you, Larry. I know you from years before when I was with Pop in Newark, when I was younger. Power to the people.
Power to the people.
And thank you for your incisive, cold water truth-telling, which many of us love to hear. Thank you very much for that. The question I have has to do with us as a legislative ministry. Our focus is and has been legislation, passing legislation, and advocating to pass legislation. But obviously, we understand, many of us understand, that this is only part of the picture, and this is only part of the struggle. And you have correctly Councilman, I agree, pointed out that sometimes you pass legislation and it doesn't make much of a difference. We can do many examples. But the real question is how can we as a legislative ministry combine our work to get good laws passed? And there are dozens of laws now in the New Jersey legislature to various degrees that are very well intentioned and can make a difference.
Right.
And I think they have to be supported. How can we combine that with advocacy and developing a movement which combines black and white together in the strongest way which is necessary to make real changes in this country? And if I may say, we invite you, if you wish, to attend the Criminal Justice Reform Task Force where we can talk about some of these laws.
All right. I think we need all aspects. We need legislation, we need agitation, we need education. All of them work together. Like when people come to us with police brutality cases, first thing I ask them, do you have a lawyer? Because we could protest outside. I could do that part for you. But you gotta have somebody inside fighting for you too. So legislation is just as important, and you're doing good work already. And I think the way that you have proceeded so far is the way you have to proceed in the future. When the call comes from groups like ours to join with us in agitation, that's the point at which the legislation and the agitation unite together. And then our protests become a platform for you to tell people about the legislation that they should support. Like, you know, this $15 minimum wage, they haven't passed it yet. And, you know, this whole thing, you know, it's just, oh my God. They have a bill for $15 an hour minimum wage, but you won't reach that till 20-something. By 20-something, you're going to need $21 minimum wage. Don't you know that if the minimum wage had kept pace with inflation, it would be $21 an hour today? If it had kept pace with inflation from just 1967. What we need in this country is a living wage for all working people. All working people need a living wage. And this goes to show you just how messed up things got since 1968. Do you know what anniversary we'll come up on in a couple of weeks? May 12th will be the anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign. The campaign that Dr. King was going to lead after he left Memphis. It was to begin on Mother's Day. Mother's Day, 1968. And do you know what they were calling for? Now this is the civil rights movement, which had been criticized for being too mild. Do you know what they called for in 68? Guaranteed minimum income for everybody.
Amen.
For everybody. Which I believe, don't they have that in Denmark? Or one of those Scandinavian countries, they have a guaranteed minimum income, period. I mean, when I first read this years ago, when I first started reading Dr. King, by the way, one thing that I hope that you would, in your legislative push, one thing you would do, if we're going to have a Dr. King's holiday, push these Board of Educations to make some of Dr. King's writings required reading. I mean, what sense does it make to close the schools if the kids don't know nothing about what Dr. King stood for? He wrote 6 books. Measure of a Man, Stride Toward Freedom, Strength to Love, Why We Can't Wait, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Trumpet of Conscience. None of those books, I challenge someone to show me the school system where just one of those books, a child must read by the time they graduate 12th grade. They don't even do the I Have a Dream speech. You know, we used to make jokes, oh, I have a dream, you know, but they don't even do that. Dr. King he mentioned the I Have a Dream speech. He mentions police brutality 3 times in the I Have a Dream speech.
So I'm hoping, I mean, that's not legislation, but that's like school board legislation. You know, if we're going to close all the schools, let's have a curriculum that's related to the holiday. But did I get far afield here? Talking about May 12th. By the way, on May 11th, People's Organization for Progress, we will commemorate the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. The County of Essex just erected a new statue, a new King statue at 465 Martin Luther King Boulevard. That's the Hall of Records right there on the corner. Is a Dr. King statue. On Wednesday, May 11th, we'll be meeting there at 4:30. We're going to have a march to commemorate the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. And we're going to re-raise the demands that they were making in 68. I mean, that's how far back we've come. You know, it's just like, excuse me for a second, it's just like the other day when Bernie and Hillary were debating, right? And Bernie Sanders wasn't saying anything particularly radical. All he said was that the Palestinian people deserve respect and human dignity, and everybody started applauding. He didn't even get to like two-state solution or one-state solution or, you know, stop settlement. He didn't even get to that. Our discourse had become so right-wing that it was just a burst of light to hear anybody say that we should have an even-handed policy.